July 27th, 2018, and this is session 2 of the group workshop.
Great. Okay, so tonight we're going to spend some time talking about the final quadrant of our King Warrior, Queen Warrior, Lover Magician model. So we'll be talking about the King and the Queen.
And you'll be talking really loud.
Sorry, I'll try to speak up. If I start dropping down, somebody hit me or do something.
This will
Yeah,
be
there
our
you go.
code.
There you go.
Just
That's it. You'd think I would talk loudly because I'm hard of hearing. I don't know what the problem is.
What'd you say?
We can talk about that.
Oh, you'll help him with that later.
All right.
Okay.
In some ways, this is kind of the culmination of this model, of course. And first weekend we spent exclusively pretty much on the magician. Last weekend we did the lover warrior axis. That's a little bit easier to talk about in some way. The magician's a little difficult to talk about, but the king and the queen are also in some ways difficult to talk about. Not the least of which, of course, that we're in a culture that was founded, a nation that was founded on the principles of not having kingship, which plays out in some very interesting ways. So for us, it's a little bit more mysterious, perhaps, than it would be, say, for somebody who grew up in a country like England, where they've had kings and queens forever. But it's also mysterious just because of the very energy of this particular quadrant. And so it's sometimes a little bit difficult to wrap your head around. And I'm going to do my best to try to convey some of the main points of it, but truly we could spend several weekends talking about just the sovereign energy. In some ways, it's the final attainment of the goal of integration of all this material. The king and the queen are really about suffering and sacrifice. That's part of the reason we don't know much about it. We're not really into that kind of thing too much in this particular culture. But it is also about regeneration, renewal, and responsibility. It's about blessing, creativity, and it's about creating cosmos out of chaos. That's it right there. I've given you the whole talk, so I'll actually try to elaborate that. But that's, again, one of the difficulties is we don't have much way historically in our country to talk about this, although we typically try to turn presidents into king. We haven't had a woman president yet, so presumably we may turn her into queen. But we have turned some of the wives of presidents into queens, notably Jackie Kennedy. And I'll talk a little bit about the Kennedy administration in the context of all this. But the best way to get at this material is actually like all psychological material. The best way to get at it is through story, myth, movies even. And the two main stories in our culture that have a lot to do with kingship, although a lot of people don't really realize that they have a lot to do with kingship, is first of all the Christian story. And whether or not you identify as being Christian or not Christian, or whatever you think about Christianity, or particularly the historical or the theological or metaphysical aspects of the Christian story, it's a story about kingship. And I'm going to try to elaborate some on that as well tonight. It's a story that came in at the beginning of our current era, particularly for those of you who are astrologically orientated. It came in when the precession of the equinoxes moved out of the age of Aquarius into the age of Pisces. And you really can't understand the symbolism in Christianity without understanding the astrological sign of Pisces. But it was this story that burst on the scene, and it literally changed society. And again, no matter what you believe about it or how you relate to it, you are in that story. And some of us more than others, of course. Some of us painfully so. But the other great story that also heralded, I believe, the modern epic are the Grail romances. Are all of you familiar with the term the Grail romances?
No.
So you're not? Okay. Well, there's actually three branches of it, but there are a series of stories that burst on the scene around the 12th century. They're also known as the quest for the Holy Grail, the Arthurian legends. It's called the Matter of Britain. It's the story of the bumbling fool, Parsifal, and I'm going to talk a good bit about this particular story. I'm not going to go into too much around the Christian story, although I'll reference it some. But this burst on the scene in the 1200s, and so a lot of historians particularly date the modern era all the way back to the Renaissance that happened in the 12th century. Some of the Arabic material began to pour into the West. Again, some of the reclaimed material from the Greeks began to come in around the 12th century. There was a great flowering of architecture in the form of the Gothic cathedrals, as well as the, much to the church's dismay, the rising cult of veneration of Mary, the mother of Jesus. It also coincided with the beginning of what we would call romantic love, which is really not seen in Western culture until the 12th century. I get a big kick when you hear a lot of people who try to defend their idea of marriage, and they talk about this as if it was something that went on forever and ever. Well, in fact, marriages prior to the 12th century didn't have anything to do with romantic love. They were often arranged marriage. They were marriages that had to do with transference of property. The whole idea that you would be in love really doesn't come in until about the 12th century in both the literature and things like the troubadours and this, again, sort of flowering. And in one way, one could say it was the bursting forth of the feminine. And even though the Grail stories, on a superficial reading of them, seem to have to do with male initiation, on a deeper level, they actually have to do with balancing the male and the female. And I'll try to weave that into it. But if you're not familiar with those, there are three different branches of these stories. They're sort of slightly different in the way they end and somehow the treatments and some of the aspects of it. But in shorthand, it's the story of this young boy who is being raised by his mother. His father was a knight who was killed in battle. His uncles had been killed. So his mother, in order to protect him, has taken him out into the back of beyond and is living out in the woods and protecting him from any knowledge of knighthood traditions. And he's not real bright, but he spends his days in the woods and doesn't have a lot of social contact. And his mother is, again, trying to protect him from him ever being engaged in the masculine arts of knighthood due to this history. And then at one point, he's out on wandering around, and these three knights come riding up, and they're in their full uniforms and their dress, and he sees them, and they're just dazzling in the bright light, and he thinks they're angels, because his mother has told him about God and about angels. And he's so taken by them that he's just like enchanted, and they're trying to get directions out of him. They're trying to ask him how to get to a certain place, and he won't even answer the question. He just keeps asking them about all their knighthood stuff, and finally they say something like, well, it's dumb Welchman, which kind of meant, you're really a buffoon. And they tell him, look, if you want to be a knight, you have to go to King Arthur's court, and then they ride off. So he goes back and he starts telling his mother all about this experience, and that his great desire now is to go off to the court of King Arthur and become a knight. And of course his mother is just horrified by this, and she tries to talk him out of it, and she does everything in her power to convince him to stay with her, but he's just hell-bent on becoming a knight. And so she decides that the best thing she can do for him is she spins a homespun garment that just makes him look like a real buffoon, and she makes him agree that he'll wear it no matter what. And so he puts on this garment, which again makes him look rather stupid and uncouth, gets on a horse and rides off, and the mother immediately faints and actually dies from heart brokenness. he goes through a series of adventures. Again, I'm just giving you the highlights here, but he goes through a series of adventures, a lot involving women and females and the relationship to females. He finally makes it to King Arthur's court, and he goes into the court and he says, I want to be knighted. And of course everybody laughs at him because here he is, this country buffoon walking in expecting to just be knighted. But there's an unusual omen that happens. There's a woman in the court who has not laughed in 20 years. And the prophecy is that she will laugh when a chosen one comes in to the court. And she sees Parsifal and starts laughing. And so this is like perks up everybody's ears a little bit. And then, again, various versions of the story will give you different nuances to this. But at one point, one of the knights of the Round Table, is just tired of this buffoon, and so he tells Arthur, "Yeah, well, let's make him a knight. Let him go off and fight. He'll get slaughtered the first day." About that time, this big red knight comes riding into the court on his horse, which is a total affront to the sovereignty, and he creates havoc in the banquet hall and knocks over all the wine and the goblets and spills it on the queen and insults her, and then yells other insults and then rides off. And so some of the knights, send this Parsifal after him. Yeah, let him go. And he goes out and he finds the Red Knight, challenges him. They square off as knights would want to do, and Parsifal's knocked off of his horse. And then the Red Knight's coming back around to, still mounted, to finish him off. And Parsifal throws his javelin, and just by good luck, the javelin goes right into the eyepiece of the Red Knight, and it kills him. But he's so stupid, he doesn't know how to get the armor off of the Red Knight. Somebody has to come and help him do that. Anyway, he goes through these greater and greater adventures, and eventually he winds up lost in a way, and lost in life, and he winds up coming across an old man in a boat fishing. And it's a very unusual situation because the old man is out in the middle of the river, and it's very calm in the middle of the river, but on each side of the old man, the water is just rushing by like crazy. And Parsifal asked him, "Is there a place where I could stay?" He said, "Yeah, there's a castle right down the road. You can go down there, you can stay there the night." And so he makes his way down to this castle, and somehow the old man has beat him back to the castle, and it turns out that the old man is actually the king of the castle. But he suffers a tremendous wound. He's, in most versions of the story, the old man king is in agony because he's been wounded in the testicles. There's a spear in the testicles. It cannot be pushed through and it cannot be pulled out. So he lives in agony. The only time he gets any kind of reprieve from this is when he's fishing. But the rest of the time he's laying and groaning in agony. And so there's a big banquet prepared. They bring in Parsifal, and some strange, mysterious things start happening. Some women begin to come out with these religious objects, one of which is the paten, which is, for those of you who are Catholic, grew up Catholic, is the container that holds the wafer, which is the symbol for the body of Christ. And another one comes in holding the chalice, which represents the grail, and the cup that held the blood of Christ. Another one comes in with what's attributed to called the spear of Longius, which is the spear that supposedly pierced the side of Christ, and it's dripping with blood. And this is very, very mysterious because it's all led by women. Now, if you think about the time period, the Catholic Church was totally dominated, and still is to a large degree, by males. The idea of women participating in a religious ceremony was just unheard of. So this is an interesting kind of twist in this thing, because all the women are incredibly important to this whole thing. And Parsifal is dumbfounded by this, and he's very curious, but he's been told not to ask questions. So he fails to ask the question. What he should have asked was, what was the meaning of all this? Or it's another interpretation of, who does the Grail serve? So he fails to do that, and then the next morning he wakes up and everybody in the castle's disappeared. His horse is tied up out in the courtyard. He goes and gets on his horse, rides out across the drawbridge, and as soon as he rides away, the drawbridge closes up and the whole Grail castle disappears. And so he spends another 20 years through all kinds of adventures, and he eventually winds up back at the Grail Castle. This time, he's got the good sense to ask, who does the Grail serve? And at this point, the old Fisher King is healed, but Parsifal steps into his role as the new king. Now, that's the Reader's Digest version of this story, and please forgive me for those of you who actually know the story. I'm just hitting the high points here. But it's a story about, obviously, initiation. It's a story about balancing the masculine and feminine, but it's a story about woundedness and the healing of woundedness. And it's a story about the king and the queen. It's about the sovereign. Is everybody with me so far? Okay. Again, I know this is very different than just giving you the real high points to this story. But I want to use this story to help illustrate some of the facets of what it really means to develop the sovereign, both us stepping into the sovereign, but then also how that plays out in both our families and our culture and our whole world. So all of you are probably familiar with this story because most of you have seen, how many of you, well, I'll just ask, how many of you saw the comedy Monty Python's The Holy Grail? Okay. All of you are familiar with that's not a horse, that's coconut. How many of you saw the movie that Robin Williams did in the early 90s called The Fisher King?
Yes.
Oh, great. Almost everybody's seen it. Okay.
I don't remember it too.
Yeah,
Okay. That's okay because we're actually going to show the film tomorrow night. So
It's an awesome film if you haven't seen it.
it's truly an awesome film, and it's layered and layered and layered with meaning. But you have not seen the film at all. Okay. I'll try to talk enough about it that you'll kind of grasp it anyway. But tomorrow night after dinner, we're going to meet here and see the film again.
And it's
So,
optional, but if you want to,
yeah,
you're welcome to
it's
join
optional,
us.
but I really encourage all of you to come back and see it.
Can we wear our pajamas?
Yes, you
Pardon?
can, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. You can wear
Pajamas and popcorn.
Absolutely.
The exception, and we can have popcorn in the
So the basics of this film, it's all about woundedness, and it's about the healing of wounds and the mechanism of that, and also in many ways about the Fisher King, which refers to the Grail King, the wounded king. And there's an ancient idea, again for us in this culture, it's a little bit difficult because we don't have any history of actual kingship and queenship, but there's a pretty long history of kingship and queenship in human culture. And you have to sort of ask yourself the question, why do we have that? And there are lots of different ways to take a look at that. But in this particular film, it's a modernized version of the Fisher King story. And it's very cleverly done. It was actually oddly written, I believe, and directed by Terry Gilliam, who was one of the Monty Python players. A very talented man from my point of view. But it starts off the movie, you see this, a character played by Jeff Bridges, the actor Jeff Bridges, and he's a shock jock. It's like Howard Stern. It's one of these people that, was on television, particularly in the early 90s. This was quite a new phenomenon in some ways. But he's just very misogynistic. He's very, he doesn't like humans very much. He's extremely inflated. He's absolutely thinks he's just God's gift to the world. And makes a living out of insulting people, essentially, on the air. And so he is quite full of himself, again, totally inflated, pretty quick, a lot of magician kind of stuff, but a lot of an inflated king. And he has one caller calls him who's, turns out, mentally disturbed. And this guy starts talking about he's fallen in love with a woman he's met at some yuppie bar. And Jeff Bridges' character starts telling him how these yuppies are all terrible people, they all got to be killed. He's just making this offhanded remark. And then you see, a couple scenes later, Jeff Bridges is in his penthouse up in the, several stories high, And he turns on the news, and there's his picture, and then the next scene is a picture of a mass murder that's taken place. The guy he sort of told on the radio that all these yuppies should be killed decided to actually go out and do it, and brought a shotgun into this restaurant and blew several people away. And so that, of course, just ends his career. And then you fast forward in the film to 3 years later, he's not really working, but he's supposed to be working with his now lover partner. She owns a video store, but he's basically just drinking all day long. He's just turned into a lush. And she can't get him to do any work, and he's still one of those people that hates people. And his life has just gone to hell in a handbasket. And so then they get into a fight, and he goes out, he's been on a bender, and he goes out, he's standing on, I guess it would be the Hudson River, and he decides to commit suicide and straps a bunch of cement blocks to his feet. He's about to jump in the water, and just at that moment, these two teenager punk kids come roaring up in their Jeep, and they're out looking for a homeless person to beat up and kill, essentially. And so they mistake Jeff Bridges as a homeless person, and so they attack him and pour gasoline all over him. They're just about to light the fire when suddenly Robin Williams' character shows up, who is this homeless, crazy person, and mentally ill. And he essentially stops the attack. And that begins the connection between these two characters. And then at a certain point, Jeff Bridges discovers that Robin Williams' character, who's called Perry in the movie, he was a professor who taught the Grail romances. But he was in the restaurant with his wife when the murderer came in that night, and his wife was killed. And that threw him into complete mental illness. And so the story, as it develops, first of all, Jeff Bridges gets all this guilt going on, and so he tries to help him by giving him money. He's trying to buy his way out of the responsibility for the fact that it was his remark that led to this whole sequence of events. And so the story begins to involve these two. And Robin Williams, of course, is the most magician-possessed comic I think has ever lived. I mean, the guy was truly manic, and yet just flooding with magician energy. He was so quick and so fast and so funny. And so, of course, now, many years later, when Robin Williams himself committed suicide over, at least somewhat attributed to some mental difficulties, the movie just takes on even more meaning. But I think it's his greatest performance. And he plays this homeless character who has, in effect, started living what we would call mental illness, but he's living a symbolic life. He tells Jeff Bridges' character, Jack, who's called Jack Lucas, he tells him, Jack, I'm on a mission from God. I'm a knight. I'm here to rescue the Grail. And of course, Bridges is looking at him like he's just crazy and off guard, and he goes, no. He says, I'm on a mission from God. I'm supposed to get the Grail. And he digs out this newspaper clipping, and it's a picture of a very wealthy person who lives in Manhattan, I guess. And on his bookshelf is a trophy, probably a golf trophy or something, but it's a cup shaped like a chalice. And Robin Williams thinks that's the Holy Grail. And of course, from one point of view, you can look at it and go, well, Robin Williams was just nuts. But from another point of view, that mental illness has thrown him into the archetypal dimension. He's living the Grail myth. And so he begins to try to recruit Jeff Bridges' character to help him go get this Holy Grail. And of course, Bridges tries to get away from him, and then the whole thing starts to proceed where he can't get away from him, and his own guilt keeps him coming back. And the story gets, some other details to it, not the least of which is that Perry...
I'm not going to tell him the whole story. Oh,
what?
Don't tell him the whole story.
No, I won't tell you the whole story, but...
It's not you.
what?
The highlights.
Well, Perry falls in love with this woman, but it's from a distance. He doesn't dare approach her. He's never talked to her. He just observes her coming and going out of her office building. And that's actually a reference to this whole idea of romantic love. It was the idea that you held the feminine in such high esteem that it was not necessarily a consummated type relationship. So you begin to see a lot of these little elements of the Grail myth woven into this modern story. The main point of it, though, is that Bridges' character is suffering because he's committed this horrible faux pas, and that's led to this enormous tragedy. Robin Williams' character is suffering because of this tremendous trauma and loss, and yet their lives are kind of brought together. And ultimately what happens is they do wind up actually experiencing healing. And it's actually healing through relationship and love. At one point, Bridges is trying to talk him out of going after this golf trophy, which he thinks is the Holy Grail. And Robin Williams says, "Oh, you do care about me. You really do care about me, don't you?" And again, coming from Bridges' character, who's a cynical, guy who hates humanity, he's actually becoming human. And he transforms his life with his partner Lover, which is played by Mercedes Buell. Perry transforms. The whole movie is about transformation, but it's also about coming into this position of maturity where you can care more for someone else than what you plan to get back from them, which is one of the hallmarks of King energy. So, again, I'm going to use the story, and I'll keep referencing the story, and then I think once we see it tomorrow night, after what we've talked about tonight, you may see some things that maybe you didn't necessarily put into this kind of framework.
Can you say that one more time? Just that last sentence about king energy.
The ability to care
You care
for
more
someone
Yeah,
else
Yeah.
more than you
the
care for
ability
yourself.
to care for someone else more than you care for yourself is one of the hallmarks of the king and the queen.
But you said more than,
You care about what you'll get back.
more than you expect to get back.
Correct.
Yeah.
In fact, the true king doesn't expect to get anything back.
Mm-hmm.
True queen doesn't expect to get anything back.
It's true service.
Yeah,
Service and caring.
and you'll have to forgive me because I may at times, when I'm talking about the sovereign, I may accidentally talk about the king more than the queen. I don't mean to do that. Sovereign is just always hard for me to kind of say. I don't know why it doesn't roll off my tongue very well. But we're talking about the sovereign energy, whether it's in the male expression of the king or the female expression of the queen. This is an interesting side note. 3 of the most successful sovereigns of England were all women. So don't fall into the trap of thinking this is just about males and kings. Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria, and the current queen, who's now been in office longer than any of them. Those, I think, regarded by most historians as the most successful monarchs of all. We should learn some lessons from this. But, yes.
How would you define sovereign?
Well, I'd go back to kind of what I said. The sovereign is the archetype that has to do with creating cosmos out of chaos. It's the archetype that has to do with creativity, generativity. It's the archetype that brings order and centeredness. It's the archetype that has to do with blessing.
Can I give a quick example?
Sure.
So let's just put it into real 3D terms. You have a male or female who throws himself into the corporate world and is at the very height of success, of human success, for many, many years, and builds up a huge company, maybe an empire, and then comes time to retire. Okay, one person goes off to the golf course and plays golf the rest of their life. The other person decides that he's going to start an organization for young men and begins to mentor. So he throws all of his life and his energy into giving back to the community. He might be mentoring, he might be, birthing new organizations, and all along the way is not looking to see what he can get, but he's only looking to give back. Okay.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, so that's one way to look at it. So that's a person who mentors and blesses. It's a person who sees the gold in someone else, and it's very much connected to the positive mother and father, because a good father or a good mother only wants to see that child succeed and grow up. And also a very powerful part of this is they delight in their child actually superseding them, coming up in the ranks and going beyond them, okay? And that delights them. So you can see it with parents, good parents, positive parents.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this at a lot of different levels, not only your own inner psyche level, but your family system level, your community system level, national kind of level. And it will be easier to talk about the shadow side of this, because that's what we're most familiar with.
Yeah.
It's true, of course, of all four of these archetypal patterns. In the modern world, we're much more prone to see examples of the shadow side of this. So, but I don't want to just talk about the shadow side of this. I want to talk about the ideal of this as well. And the ideal would be, this is the place where you look for order. This place where you look for calmness. This is a place where you look for creativity and blessing, and also taking responsibility. Again, the ability to consider others and give without getting back. So it's very interesting, if you ask small children, even in America where we've never had a king or a queen, you ask a 4-year-old child, well, tell me what a good king is. They'll tell you all about it. Tell me what a bad king is. They'll tell you all about it. They know. They have plugged into that archetypal patterning. Again, we're a country that was founded on not having kings or queens, yet we continue to try to turn our presidents into kings and queens, or our Hollywood stars sometimes. It's kind of a substitute for that. I learned a great deal about this when I lived in England for a year when I was going to graduate school. And it was a powerful education for me, because I began to sense the centrality of that kingship and the royal family, as goofy as they can be, and as much as the tabloid press now tries to expose every dark secret that they have, but how truly committed people are to the monarchy. I mean, there are places where you just don't want to mention that it's not a good idea to have a monarch. That people get quite riled up about it. And I begin to see how they have a centrality that we are lacking. And one of the easiest places to see this is if you go to any size town in England, I don't care, the smallest little hamlet, all the way up to London. I don't know how many people live in London. I think it's something like 16 million people or something. It's a gigantic city. But every one of those cities and towns and large metropolises has a center. And that's where the transportation runs out of. It all runs to the center. That's where the so-called high shops are. The best places are downtown. When you think about America, we might have had that to a certain degree, like the little town I grew up in, the courthouse was in the center of the square, and all the retail merchants faced the courthouse. So in one way, it was very much like a center. And then we moved into this Walmartization, I call it, of America. Walmart came to town, built right on the edge of town, so they didn't have to pay any city taxes. And within 10 years, all the businesses were gone. There's no center, and the whole thing kind of collapses. We don't really have a psychological center to our cities. The city I lived in Illinois, I moved there in 1977, and they were doing things then to try to get people to come downtown, because when they built the freeway through this town, instead of running it through the center of town like some of the people wanted, the city father said, oh no, we don't want the damn freeway in the middle of town. Let's move it out to the edge of the county. So they literally built it at the edge of the county, and predictably, the city moved out to the freeway, abandoning the whole west side of the town, and which included the downtown. And every year I was there was some new group of magicians that formed a study to figure out how to get people to come downtown. And they never could do it. I mean, because people didn't want to go downtown. People perceived it as crime-ridden. People perceived it as not a safe place to be. And I think there's something psychological to that. We're sort of lacking a center. And for all of their faults, and you can make many cases against them because they're humans, but they serve an archetypal function that we're missing. I'm not advocating that we go back to having kings and queens in a literal sense, but I think we have to bring some awareness to this particular function, because this is the thing that holds everything else together. And when the other archetypal energies of this quadrate itself have a sovereign to serve, then they become mature. If they don't have a sovereign to serve, they turn very shadowy. So the warrior, for example, without a king or a queen, turns into a mercenary. And you might be able to admire them for their efficaciousness, but they don't have any commitment to anything higher than themselves. They're just like Luke Skywalker in the original Star Wars. You know, I don't give a damn about your revolution. I'm in this for the money.
You're talking about Harrison Ford.
Yes, Harrison Ford's character in
Han Solo.
So the magician without some sovereign to serve can also turn into the detached manipulator, which is now what we have running Wall Street. And the lover, without some higher purpose to serve, turns into addiction. So it, I think, is incredibly important for us to reflect on and think about what is the function, what's the role, what's the pathology, how do I bring this into being? Because if you do bring this online, suddenly your life becomes a whole lot more organized. You're a lot less chaotic. You'll have a lot less drama. You'll be much more calm in response to other people's drama. You'll have a much better sense of mission, and you'll be a much better human. Failures to bring this online, I can relate to lots and lots of difficulties that we have, both, again, from the family level all the way up.
Is everybody clear about service to a sovereign, what that means? It could be a higher ideal, you know, it could be a purpose, it could be a community, a group, it could be your family, it could be just service to something greater than yourself, or a purpose greater than yourself. And what he's saying is, if all these other archetypal energies aren't guided by a higher purpose or ideal, then they go into their shadow form.
An observation, my ex-husband's Australian, and we spent a lot of Christmases in Australia. And as much as they have kind of animosity for England, and they wanted it off the flag even. There's the Union Jack as part of the Australian flag. They wanted that taken off the flag. But the Queen's address, everybody stops what they're doing in the middle of Christmas holidays and watches the Queen's address on TV. Like it's still their Queen. And they all still wear those white wigs to Parliament and all that.
Really?
So there's this disdain, but there's still that energy of, but she's our queen, so we have to watch her address.
I don't think there's any more powerful demonstration of this than the life and death of Princess Diana. As much as she was raked over the coals in the tabloids, as much as all of her shadow was exposed, and she had a considerable shadow, she served an archetypal function. And when she died, it was unbelievable, the outpouring of grief. It was a whole world. Even people in America were moved by her death. So when a particular human serves in this archetypal way, they're not, on some level, their lives are not their own. I mean, you might think it's a great thing, it would be a great thing to be a royal family. You'd be living in a prison. And in some cultures, you would literally be in a prison. There's a very ancient idea that the health of the kingdom is directly related to the health of the king or the queen. And thus, if the kingdom goes to hell, like in the Fisher King story, where everything is desolate, the Fisher King is wounded, so the cattle start producing, the crops start producing, it's gray and rainy all the time. In ancient cultures, you get your head chopped off and a new king put into place. And again, if you think of the restrictions of the royal family, if you told me tomorrow that I could trade places with one of them, I wouldn't do it. I mean, you couldn't go out in public. You couldn't hop in the car and run down the street. You couldn't go to a concert. I mean, without massive amounts of protection around you. It would literally be a prison. But they start serving an archetypal function. Now, again, they're still human. And of course, in the case of Princess Diana, it was getting very difficult for the royal family. First of all, she had divorced, which is not a cool thing. Then secondly, it came out that she was having a number of affairs, of course, in response to Charles having a number of affairs, which I'll talk about that in a minute. But she was also getting ready to marry a Muslim. So the head of the future king of England, who's the head of the Anglican Church, was about to have a mother who was going to be married to a Muslim. That was not cool. And she was killed, of course, in a tragic car accident in one of the underpass tunnels in Paris. I happened to be there 4 years later. 4 years later, staying at a little hostel very near that underpass. And at the opposite end of the underpass where she was killed, there was a World War II memorial. It was a big concrete flame. It's about this big, and it was set in a big, 12 by 12 square. And this was 4 years later, and that was still covered with fresh flowers and recent notes from people as a commemorative to her. So even 4 years later, people were still outpouring their grief about her. And even today, she's still admired around the world as being really just the archetypal princess. But I saw very clearly that this royal family actually serves a role in terms of keeping stability in the country. And the parliament can come and go, and all sorts of different kind of things happen. But it also unites people in some ways, which is part of the problem we have now, is that we're so polarized, we have nothing to unite us. And even like you're saying, in Australia, where they want to get rid of everything, the Queen speaks, everybody stops. So there's something really built into us about this archetypal material that I think is critical and important. So thus, in our country, we haven't really ever had a king or queen, and the closest we've come to it is John F. Kennedy. He came on the scene as the youngest president ever elected. He was dashingly good looking. He was very smart. And he had this beautiful wife. And literally, they named their administration Camelot. And they joke about it a little bit, but they were pretty serious. And in fact, the way it played out with his death, you can understand it as the archetypal drama. Because one of the things about the king and the queen is that they're sacrificial. It's built into the archetype that the old has to be sacrificed before the new can come into being. I'm going to relate this, hopefully, within this talk to our ego self-axis, because that's also the dynamic that takes place in that. But one way to understand John F. Kennedy, particularly his enormous promiscuity, if he wouldn't have gotten away with it, half of what he got away with, but in that time period, the press was not so regicide as they are today. And so even though the press knew about his affairs, they would never speak about it. But he was really apparently very promiscuous. Well, in one way, if you're operating under the king archetype, the king sort of owns all the kingdom and all the women and everything in it, so there's not a real great moral conflict from their point of view. His death, of course, as tragic as it was, it also brought this nation together. I mean, I can remember exactly where I was when I found out that he'd been shot, and the reactions of my schoolmates, many of which had been taught to hate him already because he was for civil rights and they were against it. But even after that kind of display of celebration by a lot of people, everybody went into grief. Just almost everybody did. And I can remember my mother sitting in front of the television just bawling. I mean, just absolutely, truly shaken. I think that's probably the closest we've come to it, but again, they weren't too much kidding about this being Camelot. They sort of idealized that thing, and that may have been the closest we've come to this. Some of the characteristics of the king, or the king and the queen, is that they are centered. In some ways, they're the center of the realm, and they bring order just by their very being. They're also decisive. They're not, a good, really good king or queen are not wishy-washy. Do all of you remember the story from the Bible about the two women that come to the king and they're arguing over whose child? Both of them claim that they're the mother of this child. I forget if it's Solomon or David.
Solomon.
Is Solomon? Okay. King Solomon, who's supposedly extremely wise, says, well, okay, just take out a sword and cut the baby in half. And of course, the true mother says, "Oh, no, it's hers." And he said, "Oh, I know it's yours. Give the baby to the real mother," because the real mother wouldn't allow the child to be killed. That's a decisive king. That's not wishy-washy. So the more you develop your own sovereign, the more decisive you will be. This goes along with some things like confidence. You will not be afraid to make decisions. The more out of touch with this you are, the more you'll just be kind of all over the place, and I'm not sure about this, and so forth and so on. There is in the good king and queen, there's a deep sense of integrity. They are who they say they are. They're not putting up a front. Again, they provide order. They're the lawgivers. Think about he wasn't a king, but he was a leader of the Jewish people, Moses, who brings the law. He goes up on the mountain and comes down with the 10 Commandments, the law. So there's a built-in commitment to justice. One of the other qualities about the sovereign is that they are creative. They create, and they take great delight in everybody else's creativity. So if you get, some of you may have had this experience, I had it once. I had a clinical supervisor who was really into her queen. And she knew that all of us knew more than she did about every specific area of this agency and therapy and counseling we were doing. But she saw her role as to create the conditions to allow us to do our jobs the best. She was not threatened by us. She took great delight when we were successful. Now, there happened to be a shadow king at that particular agency. So I'm going to tell you this little drama just to kind of tell you how this stuff is not just about kings from the distant past. It takes place right here in River City right now. I went to work for this agency. They hired me to do an experimental program, and this clinical director was really wonderful. Just absolutely, I never worked with one like her. And this particular agency had bought a hotel and converted each floor to a different department. So there was a detox center on one floor, an outpatient on one floor, an inpatient on one floor, and then they had a floor left over which they wanted me to do an experimental halfway house, which I designed and opened up. But they had a problem with funding, and one of the reasons they had a problem with funding is because they had a really terrible detox unit, and they had lost a couple of people. And when they lost those people, the courts decided that they had so many problems at that agency that they were going to not refer to them anymore. So they cut off all referrals. Well, that represented a pretty significant chunk of change in terms of their funding. So I get there and I build this program and I get it opened up and I realize that there's not the money that they said they had. And so I went to the clinical director and I said, we really need to get these referrals back. And she said, well, yeah, I don't know, but the courts have cut us off and there's all this problem we have with the detox unit. And I said, well, do you mind if I go talk to the head judge? And she said, no, I don't mind at all. And I said, well, I'm going to try to see if I can get an appointment with the guy. I called him up, got an appointment with him, went down, started telling him all the stuff that we were doing and trying to get him excited about the changes that I was bringing to the place and also other things. He got really interested and he said, well, I think, we could be open to having another meeting. And so I took my clinical director with me and we had another meeting with him. At the end of that meeting, he said, well, I'm very impressed by what you folks have done and you've seem to be turning things around. And he told us then he would give us back the referrals. So I go back to the agency, I think, hey, I've just done something really great here. And I expected to be, at least given some accolades about it. But the guy who ran the agency absolutely went the opposite. He was pissed. He was absolutely livid that I had done this. Even though it was good for the agency, it made him look bad. And he began to plot at that point how to get rid of me. And it didn't take him very long. That's the example of the Shadow King who can't take any delight in the creativity of his subjects or his underlings. Whereas with her, it was exactly the opposite. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So they're threatened.
They're
by
very,
any-
oh yeah.
By anyone that comes up underneath them, they're threatened. And in the female world, that's called a queen bee. The queen bee kills off all the other females in the hive, and as the other females rise up, she kicks them off the mountain. So there's only one at the top. So.
The true king and queen can bless. And blessing has a lot to do with us being seen, us being validated just for being who we are. There's a lot of the schools of psychotherapy have done a really enormous amount of work around this, particularly the object relations theorist. But we come in as children, we need to be seen. All this business, for example, the Pope, for those of you who are Catholic or for those of you who are not Catholic, the tremendous interest in seeing the Pope. I mean, whenever the Pope travels around the world, it's just gigantic numbers of people show up. I think in Chicago it was something like 185,000 people showed up to see the Pope. It's about being seen by that sovereign and blessed just for who you are, not for what you can do or what you have done or performance, just being seen. This is also in Eastern traditions about the importance of having the guru see you and you seeing the guru. That's what it's really supposed to be about. And the true sovereign has the ability to do that and has the knowledge that they're supposed to be doing that and does do that. And you would think that, you can bless people. It doesn't cost you anything. You think we'd be handing this out like M&Ms, but we're damn stingy with it. I mean, we just don't have a lot of people who have the capacity to actually bless other people. But that taking great delight in other people's creativity is a part of the blessing as well. But just being able to acknowledge the other person as being important. I'm glad you're in my kingdom. And not anything you do, no performance, I'll bless you if you make straight A's. I'll be proud of you if you do this. It's not that at all. It's validation and blessing for who you are. And then finally, there's a sense with the true sovereign about leaving a legacy. meaning you want to try to leave the world in a better place than what you left it. And it's a realization of higher missions beyond just personal aggrandizement. Now, I won't mention any names, but we have a lot of people who are in very high positions of power in our culture around the world, but especially here, who are absolutely, completely in the shadow side of this. They have gotten to positions of power by hook and crook. They do not deserve to be there. They do not have the capacity to bless. They do not have the capacity to think about what they should give the kingdom. It's another place where John F. Kennedy kind of comes through with this famous speech, ask not what your country can give you, but what you can give your country. That's king stuff. Whether he really meant it or not, I don't know, but you don't hear a lot of people saying that kind of thing. A lot of CEOs of corporations are now in the position where they do not give a damn about the company they're running. All they care about is getting the stock price higher so their headhunter can look for their next job. Then they don't care what they do in terms of the people or the kingdom or anything. So if I am a CEO and I come in and I see, hey, if I lay off 10,000 people, that's going to up the stock price by 5-10%. I don't care what that does to the company. I'll lay off the 10,000 people. Stock price goes up.
It'd be really hard to find in our culture a CEO who is the positive.
Well,
I would love to hear an example. I mean, I'm sure they're out there.
Oh, they are. I could name a few.
Okay, Nick.
there are.
Chobani,
Okay.
he just made everybody, they all got huge bonuses, and they all got a piece of the company. I could find that story. It's amazing. And there's
Isn't the guy that runs Costco also
there's
like this?
Well, my understanding is that he's really good, but I don't know any details. There's this movie out, you can find it probably on Netflix or something like that, called Good Fortune. And it's the co-founder of Paul Mitchell Products. And that guy has started like over 100 charities and eco-sustainable, and I mean, he's the opposite. They're so rare, they're hard to find, but it's really great to find these stories, to read them, because it integrates it into your system. You know what I'm saying?
Well, just that you can,
That you see it out in the outer world,
because when you see like
all the bad.
leadership, right, and all the corporate stuff now, it's hard to imagine that a positive king can succeed in this.
And they can.
environment.
Like you take this guy, his name was also Paul, so it's hard, I can't remember his last name, but it was the Paul Mitchell Company. Two of them started it. He was the sales side, sales and marketing, and kingship in a really powerful way. So it is important for us to find those people and read those stories and to anchor that in
And
our
also
system.
to like support those products, right? I mean, we wanna be supporting the people that are doing that. stuff.
Right, but there's a whole, that we saw, they had in the Sedona Film Festival, that movie came, and that CEO spoke after the movie. It's really neat to meet him. Yeah, so, anyway.
Well, again, the difference is if a person has done their inner work and they move into this position of sovereign, they actually have the capacity for inclusive caring. They're not just concerned about themselves. They see their role as being, in a way, the kind of the cornucopia that feeds the kingdom. And the true king and queen realizes the more they give away, the more shows up. It's not a limited thing. But if you've gotten to the position of king or queen without the development, and you're manifesting the shadow side of that, your main thought is, what can all the people in the kingdom do for me? Not what I should be doing for them. And inclusive caring is not even in your vocabulary. It's just not, it's not part of the ball game. And of course we have huge numbers of examples of all of this as we do all the shadow. But think about your own family of origin. There is a way in which you can think about the mother and the father as actually, their responsibility is to channel this archetypal energy good enough, as Winnicott would say, so that you get a sensibility and a connection to this yourself, and you can benefit from it. Now, many of us, now we have several generations of children raising children, so we don't have a lot of this. So a lot of us in this room did not get the experience of a positive king or queen. We got the exact opposite. So if you don't get the blessing, you get the curse. And again, I'm not here tonight to blame all of your parents, because
Let's
they,
do that.
well,
Let's get in the center of the room and do that right now.
well,
Let's get a
I mean,
pinata.
there you go. If your parents did not get the blessing themselves, it's pretty difficult for them to come to the developmental state of being able to do that. And so things then turn fairly pathological. Even if it's not overt pathology, which some of us in this room have suffered from that, it can be just the absence of leadership. You know, it's very wounding to have an abusive alcoholic father who comes home and hits you in the head with a shotgun handle. It's also very wounding to have a weak father who is ineffective. So the two shadow sides of the king and the queen are the tyrant, it's called the tyrant holdfast. This is a person who gets to that position and their main task is keeping that position. This is what you see in the form of dictators. If you really want to study this stuff, study Stalin.
What was it called, the one form?
Pardon?
Tyrant hold
The
fast.
tyrant holdfast.
Are you saying hold fast?
Hold fast, meaning
They
they're
hold on.
they're
They don't
hanging
let
on
go.
to the throne because they've gotten it by hook and crook, and that's their main task. So dictators, autocrats, demagogues, these kind of folks are into the shadow side of this. And there's an inherent structural thing that you should also be aware of, because you'll see it play out quite frequently, particularly in the case of dictators, but you'll see it also in the case of CEOs, and you'll see it even in the case of shadow king fathers and shadow king mothers, where the shadow king has attained the position fraudulently. They do not deserve to be there. So that means that they need a very strong group of people around them to protect them from the masses. So they hire really strong people to be their inner circle. But the problem is, if they're strong enough to be your protector, they're strong enough to take over. So every once in a while, you need to play musical chairs and take one of them out and kill them. That cuts down on people organizing against you. One of the things that Mary mentioned, or was kind of referring to, I think, shadow kings and shadow queens are very distrustful of organization. That's why there's so much chaos around them. I was in a situation once where the person running this organization was had some of these tendencies, and every time things got going good, she would tend to tear them apart. And for a while I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on, and it finally made sense to me. When things started going good in the sense of other people under her doing well, she perceived that as organization against her. But in the case of somebody like Stalin, he would just, take one of his generals out and shoot him. The same is true is happening, of course, all over the world, but particularly like in North Korea, where, every couple months we hear some general or some brother-in-law was just taken out and shot. Well, that's a very shadow king, shadow queen kind of move. But it keeps you protected, because those people are the most dangerous. The ones that are powerful enough to protect you are ones that are powerful enough to turn on you. So you'll see a lot of chaos around shadow kings and shadow queens. Again, I won't mention any names, but right now there's a situation in this country where we got a lot of chaos going on. And some of it, I think, is planned, and some of it is accidental. The opposite of that, of course, is again a sensibility about my task as a sovereign is to bring order, to create cosmos out of chaos. There is actually a way that you can read our sacred religious text, meaning the Old Testament and the New Testament, as really being largely about kingship. Most of the stories are about kings. And they're about law and order and, various other components that are attached to this. But there is a way that you can, particularly with the Christian story, the very word Christ means king. Doesn't mean anything else. That's what it means. It means king. And so the attributes, from, again, a mythological point of view, and I'm not speaking as a theologian or a metaphysician or a religious person, and regardless of what you think about it in those ways, that story encompasses king, warrior, lover, magician. I guess one could argue that the feminine element is missing, although even with that story, the Mary Magdalene figure is quite powerful. She's the first one who discovers the empty tomb after the crucifixion, and she's the first one that Jesus appears to. Now, read mythologically, that says, hey, the feminine is incredibly important. I'm not saying that that's what actually played out in the whole history of Christianity by any means.
The story's not over yet.
Yeah, exactly. It's not over yet. No, it's not over yet, and that's the main point. When you look at these stories mythologically and psychologically, they're instructive stories about what happens in our own psychic processes and what we're supposed to do. And again, regardless of what you think about the whole Christian story, the image of the cross is an incredibly powerful image of death and rebirth, death of the old, birth of the new. It's also a symbol of our horizontal and vertical, because we humans have the capacity for connecting to transpersonal, archetypal, timeless energies, and yet we're all tied to a body that's absolutely going to die. And so that awareness of that is kind of being sacrificing is a big, huge motif with that, but it's also that awareness of I'm both divine and also limited. So there's a lot of ways you can work these stories, but particularly the Christian story and then the story of the Grail myths in terms of, like, what is this saying about kingship, queenship? What is this saying about the sovereign energy? How do I develop that myself? Well, one of the things that has to take place is that our ego has to give up in a sacrificial manner its perceived position of being the center. When it does that, and when it can do that, then it opens up life for the true center, which in a Jungian point of view is called the great self within. In the kind of Christian, the great self within. It's usually written with a large S as opposed to a small s.
Okay, now translate that.
Okay, I'm going to translate
Good. Okay.
that. By the way, I want to say something. I try to say this every time I use the word ego, because there's so much misunderstanding about the word ego. Particularly when people bring Eastern traditions over to the West. In many of the Eastern writings, you will hear concepts like you must transcend your ego, you must kill your ego, you must get rid of your ego. They are not talking about the Freudian and Jungian ego, because if you get rid of your ego, you will be crazier than batshit, because you will be flooded by the contents of the collective unconscious. This is what spiritual emergency is about, and it's what psychosis is about. You do not want to get rid of an ego. However, as long as your ego believes it's the center, it's sort of the equivalent of thinking that the Earth is the center of the solar system. And then that fundamental figure foreground shift that happens when you realize that the sun is the center and the Earth revolves around the sun. So the ego is actually supposed to be the servant to the great self within, not a substitute for the great self. So the ego has to be strong enough to be willing to give up that position and become subordinate. Now this happens in initiatory processes, it happens in religious ideations and sensibilities. It happens when we start thinking about individuation processes. It happens in death rebirth sequences, like shamanistic kind of practices. It happens in things like when people hit a bottom in addiction and then move into recovery. There are lots of places where you can see this mechanism happening. But the ego fundamentally is set up to wall off the contents of the collective unconscious, so you're not flooded with all this material all the time, and thus it falls kind of into an unconscious identification with the great self. So it thinks it's the great self. Does this make sense? Is everybody getting this
Does
part?
great self mean something to everybody? Does great self, what does it mean? Higher self? What else? Higher self?
Essence.
Essence? What else?
Christ.
It's like, it would be like what Christians would say, it's like the Holy Spirit within. I mean, it's that which connects, right,
Mhm.
with.
Some people would say God,
God, yeah.
spirit,
Mhm.
higher power. Other people would talk about, their own deep essence, right? So.
See, Jung's discovery, where he greatly, radically transcended Freudian kind of sensibilities, he really discovered that by studying history, by studying myth, by studying art, by studying the creations and products of the unconscious, that in fact we have a religious function. Whether you are religious or not, we have a religious function built into the psyche. And you can see all kinds of different expressions of it with all sorts of different ideologies and images and sensibilities about that. But it's called the homo religiosus. In other words, he believed we humans have a religious function. And he came to believe that we have this archetypal self, which the structure of is what we've been doing in this whole time period. We're trying to illuminate what the structure of this thing is. But when we are born, we don't have an ego. That develops, it's actually a complex, and it develops, and you can see it fairly well developed by about 3.5, 4 years of age. Prior to that, the you and the great self within and the unconscious are all one thing. And then as the ego begins to form and separate out of that, it is partially connected to that all and partially unconsciously identified with that. And then when it completely gets separate from that great self, if we are not connected to it in a meaningful way, then life starts going really flat because you're not connected to the archetypal resources. This is a little bit hard to see, but it's actually an inflation because you're cut off from the resources of the unconscious, you're cut off from the great self within, and you are more likely to totally project it outside of yourself or to fall into the belief that there is no such thing. And thus, depression is a kind of a reverse inflation. So his discovery of this great self suddenly begins to make sense out of a lot of things that humans have done throughout history. And also it's a living thing. It's not something that just people did 2,000 years ago. It's something that's supposed to happen within all of us. Initially what happens is this great self is pretty much mediated by a religious figure. So for the Catholic, for example, when you go in and you see Jesus on the cross and a crucifix, you're seeing the archetypal energy out in front of you, and you're kind of getting it in a step-down version that you can handle. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Don't hesitate to say it doesn't make sense if it doesn't make sense. So for most people, this is how the religious function works. And if a religion actually works and works well enough, that's in fact the mechanism. It feeds you, instead of you hooking directly up to the nuclear power plant, you get it through a transformer so you can plug in the 110 outlet over there in your toaster and actually toast some bread rather than completely frying. People who tend to go directly to the great self without adequate protection tend to fry. And this happens in psychosis. You ever ask yourself, why is it that so many people who go psychotic start believing they're Jesus? That's a really interesting phenomenon, isn't it? And back in, I said this last time, I think, but back in the days when we used to have inpatient treatment centers, at any given treatment center, there'd be 3 or 4 people there who would totally believe they're Jesus, even to the point of having stigmata on the hands and feet. I mean, that's a pretty powerful manifestation of belief that it's an identification with the archetypal self. Or at other times, people start really truly believing they are the archetypal self. And that's inflation. That leads to a person becoming a narcissistic personality disorder, where they don't walk around necessarily claiming to be God, but that's how they operate, as if they were the center of the universe. In fact, you can just line up Shadow King, Shadow Queen qualities, narcissistic personality disorder categories from the DSM-4 or 5 now, and they match perfectly. Because it's a total inflation. I'm the center of the universe. I'm not the king and queen and sovereign who give to some people. I'm the one who's supposed to get from everybody. Does this ring any bells for anybody? So this sacrifice of the ego is not killing the ego. It's not getting rid of the ego. It's the ego shifting from trying to be the master to being the servant. That's part of the reason why I was playing Bob Dylan's "You Gotta Serve Somebody," which Mary asked me to play. I'll play it again later in our weekend for those of you who aren't familiar with the song. I think it was written after Bob Dylan went through a conversion where he's Jewish, but he became Christian and caught a lot of flack for that. But he wrote this song, no matter who you are, doctor, Indian, lawyer, chief, you got to serve somebody. Well, in some ways, that's really what the true kingship is about. It's about service. It's not about being served, it's actually about service. So one of the mysteries of that question of the Grail myth stories is, who does the Grail serve? We tend to think of it, and most of our religious ideation is that we serve God. But in another way, in true kingship, it's the other way around. Does that make sense to everybody? Mm-hmm. So again, the ego sacrificing itself to the great self is a matter of getting out of the unconscious identification with the great self and realizing that what you're supposed to be doing is to be in service and to help manifest that great self. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's really what the process of individuation is about. So the more you know about this archetypal structure, the more you can start consciously organizing your life and developing these archetypal patterns. And eventually, if you get enough of this brought together in enough of a mature way, you can start manifesting this great self within. And then you will truly be individuated. That make sense?
Can I briefly talk about
Sure.
for me, I'll just talk for myself. As I started to truly get connected up to this energy, I found that it started to displace the adversarial energy. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. So, like, one of the things I love that Jim always says is that our parents' job, their number one, first and foremost job, is to mediate Mother God, Father God. Be a mediator. So that means, to the best of their ability, they give you that divine blessing, because they're our imprint. We look at our mother, and that's Mother God. We look at our father, that's what we know Father God to be. So when they're giving us, when they're in their positive function, they're giving us the blessing, and their number one job is simply to ooh and awe. Oh my God, you're so gorgeous, you're so beautiful, and just stare into our face and see that divine part of us. And many of us, if not most of us, just didn't get any of that. And so when we don't get filled up with the divine blessing, the truth about who we really are, then we're highly, highly susceptible to a negative, critical energy that can tear us down, okay? So for me, even though, like, this can kind of be overwhelming when you first get connected to all of this teaching. The bottom line is that when you access it directly, so as hard as it is to not have parents that gave that to us, it sent us out on a quest. And the quest was to get connected to the real father and the real mother. Is that making sense? So as painful and wounding as it was to not get the blessing, it sent us on a spiritual search to find the real blessing or the deepest blessing. Okay? And so when you get connected to this sovereign energy, what happens is you begin to get filled. And as you fill, then you have an overflowing love that starts to pour out of you, right? You get filled with the real stuff, the divine stuff, and then all these functions that he's talking about are automatic. They're just like, that's who you are. But like for me, which has been so life-saving for me, that adversarial energy loses all power. It gets just displaced with the truth. And it's one of the things I think is, you and I will talk later, Karen, because it's one of the things that's been happening, and we won't go into it today, but when the light pours in, this is part of Dark Night of the Soul, John of the Cross, who wrote Dark Night of the Soul. As the light pours in, we experience darkness. As a human being, when the light is flooding in, our experience, at least that's what it teaches in that Dark Night of the Soul, John of the Cross, and my own personal experience. So it's important to understand that, because when that process is happening, all of the shame floods up. Is that making sense? And it's such a contrast that, you can feel really crazy during those time frames, but that's why we have a container like this. We have a place to be with that material.
There's another way you can image the Grail. Now typically particularly the Christianized version of the Grail story, is that it's a cup. It was a cup that Jesus used to pass around, to share the wine at the Last Supper. It was the cup that Joseph of Arimathea caught the blood of Jesus when he was pierced with a lance, and Joseph of Arimathea then took that chalice to England. So you get all the Arthurian stuff mixed in with this, and supposedly he took it to Glastonbury. Have any of you been to Glastonbury? None of you been there?
No, but in that shadow book that you had us read, there's one of the photographs is from Glastonbury.
Yeah, that's the Chalice Well. It's beautiful. Well, it's kind of reminds me of Sedona in a way, because there's huge numbers of people go there as tourists. It has the ruins of a 12th century abbey, and they're really spectacular ruins. They're just stunning. But it also has every other shop in town is a bookstore that sells crystals and Arthurian materials, and just huge numbers of people go there. In a way, spiritual questing. And there's also a wonderful hill there that has the ruins of a 14th century church on it. And I've been there several times, and I actually did a workshop there on all this material a couple of years ago. And it's just amazing how many of these modern people are going to this place because of its connection to these Arthurian myths. So it's not just stuff children read about and get excited about. We humans still have a desire for this. We have a desire to quest. We are seeking. We're seeking spiritual connection. We're seeking spiritual fulfillment. That particular well, it's got this wonderful iron cover, iron and wood cover. It's called the Chalice Well. But the water that comes out of it is red. It's got a very high rust content to it. And of course the legend is that Joseph of Arimathea threw the Grail into this, and it's poured forth blood-colored water ever since. But huge numbers of people go there to collect water from that just pouring out of the stream that comes out of that well. And they're doing so they're doing so for spiritual reasons. But there's a way in which you can image this Grail as being the chalice that we all have to develop. And these four-sided figures, as we develop these, we get a stronger and stronger chalice, which allows us to handle more and more archetypal energy. When we don't have a strong chalice, then that archetypal energy either leaks out all over the place, or we never have any way to contain it, and it turns quite destructive, and it turns quite shadowy. But what you're referencing is the stronger you get with this, the more you're able to fill up with this energy, and you just start doing this. You start being an integrated individual. You start being able to be in a sovereign position. And you start being much more efficacious and actually, just quite frankly, a better human being. You become better for the planet, for example. One of the key words that I haven't talked a lot about, but we should weave into this conversation, is the whole idea of stewardship. The king and the queen steward things. They don't own things. And this is an energy we badly need to reconnect with, because we're not stewarding the young, we're not stewarding initiatory processes, we're not stewarding the planet. But you see, you've got to have a sense of stewardship to even care about anything such as the planet. And if you just you can think of the planet as being a sacred space, a garden that has to be tended. You know, I'm quite sort of amazed and not really envious, because I don't like yard work, but I've been watching Brian go around very lovingly caring for all the beautiful plants around this house. Well, you have to have a sense of stewardship to do that. Otherwise, you just, the hell with it. You don't think about that. You don't put any energy into it. Or you think about it as just resources that could be used into profit. So when you go look at a redwood forest, you're not thrown into a sacred space. You're not full of awe and wonder. You're calculating board feet and how much you can get for that. This is one of the things that is truly lacking, and one of the things I think is so critical and so tied to this work is that as you become more developed in all these quadrants and you're able to connect with and develop that sovereign energy, you naturally become a better steward. You become a better steward of all of your own resources. You become a better steward for your own psyche. You become a better steward for your family. You can become a better steward for even all the way out to the planet. Does that make sense? So stewardship is another one of those almost foreign terms to us these days, but it's very much a part of what the true sovereign is able to do. So again, you can think about the opposites of all this, and this is very easy to do, to see the shadow manifestations of this, where people, for example, if I'm a high-powered CEO, I don't have any sense of stewardship at all. I'm thinking of stock price and profits. And it so happens that my company produces a toxic waste that's very expensive to deal with. The EPA comes in and I got to pay these inspectors, and processing this stuff is very costly. But I come up with a bright idea. I could ship this stuff to one of the countries in Africa where the laws are really lax. And I can do some bribes with local officials over there with some American greenbacks. We'll just ship all the toxic waste over there. Stock price goes up because I've cut expenses.
We'll just put fluoride in the water.
Pardon?
We'll just put fluoride in the water. Fluoride
Oh,
in the
yeah.
water.
The toxic waste.
Yeah, exactly. I'll find a use for it.
That's actually the same, that's exactly what
It
they did.
actually is. That's exactly what they
Actually,
did.
is what they did.
Every time when I go to my dentist, they always ask me, "Do you want fluoride?" No, I don't want any fluoride. Wait, why don't you want fluoride? Because it's
A toxin.
goddamn toxic waste product. I don't want it. Don't even give me the toothpaste that's got it in there. But you can see this is a complete absence of stewardship. I have no sensibility about my responsibility about that. I'm just a detached magician who's operating as a shadow king, and I've gotten stock prices bumped up. Meanwhile, if you don't think this is happening, folks, this is happening. I'm in a love-hate relationship with these things. I love it because I can do business anywhere. 95% of my business I do on this damn thing. And I'm one of those people that trades it about every year. And then I have the flip side of me that really feels terrible about that, because I know what's happening with this stuff. It's getting shipped to places like India, where you have very poor people who are charged with cleaning up all this stuff without any protections like they would have in a different kind of place. And this is happening all over the place. So I guess if I get my sovereign more online, I'll quit using a cell phone maybe. But that's just an example of why
I
thi-
disagree. You'll get activated in some way where you'll be supporting someone who changes the laws and changes.
Okay, all right, well, yeah, let's do
We'll
that.
figure out how to do all
Let's
that.
do that.
There's a way to do it all. Let's just say
Okay.
that. There totally is.
Yes, yes.
But anyway, you can see that in terms of how we think about our world. And contrary to popular belief, we live in a terrarium. What we do in one place is going to show up in another place.
Did you just say terrarium?
Terrarium, yeah.
Terrarium, yes.
I haven't heard that
But
word
if
for a
if we can
Mhm.
cultivate this sense of stewardship, I think again we become better humans. We become better at taking care of each other. We become better at taking care of our resources and our very planet that we live on.
Can I just say a little
Sure.
something? You know, when I was reading, really reading the Old and the New Testament, and the idea was stewardship in the beginning. We were to have stewardship on the earth. But the patriarchy turned it into dominion, right, and dominating and having it be our servant. But that's not that wasn't what was intended. I mean, even just like in the Hebrew, right? So
Yeah,
correction can get put in
absolutely.
easy. And then Christians like don't feel like they need to be responsible for taking care of the earth because Christ is coming again, and hey, everything's gonna be, right? So it's
But that's a complete bastardization.
oh, that's what I'm
of
saying,
course, right?
exactly. So
Like, just like the Old Testament, you're saying,
Yes.
yeah. And when we get a chance, and we probably don't have time tonight, but either the physical person, if Jesus actually walked the earth, or the myth of Jesus, which again is an archetypal figure, he demonstrates very powerfully all four quadrants: the lover, the magician, the warrior, and the king. And he demonstrates the positive aspect of each of those. So it's a very cool, I don't know that we have time this evening, but if you have a chance to go over that, it is really at some point. And when we
I
can
mean, again,
see
there's
it in its archetypal dimension.
lots of different ways to read these sacred texts, but one of the ways to read them is they're instructive stories about psychic processes.
Mhm.
I personally believe that's a much more powerful way to read it, but I'm not advocating anybody else do that necessarily, or at least I'm advocating you do that in addition to other things. But if you read that story that way, then it takes on a completely different meaning in one sense in terms of my responsibility for my own development. What is my cross I need to bear? What is my sacrifice I need to do? Where do I need to be more concerned about others than myself? Where do I need to try to feed the 5,000 with 5 fishes?
Mhm.
And as Mary was pointing out, I do think you can make a very strong case that the mythic image of Jesus does demonstrate all 4 of these quadrants, including the sacrificial king.
Yeah, what I had to ask myself is where do I need to be? I had all that part down, especially the Catholic Church, and we were taught to sacrifice self till you're hanging on a cross and bleeding to death. And especially as a female and a mother. So for me, I had to find the warrior aspect of Jesus, which is why I love that book, Saving Jesus, because I needed that piece. My whole life never heard it. I heard the whole sacrifice stuff, never heard the warrior stuff, really.
Well, I think some of the problem that comes in with that is that just like if you try to sacrifice your ego before you get it really well built, it doesn't work. So if you try to get into the sacrificial motif until you've gotten into the king and the queen, you're trying to sacrifice from some other place, and it doesn't really, it's not the true sacrificial energy.
Oh, really? Thought she was.
Well, yeah, for a lot of people, that's for sure.
Well,
I mean, and we, there's the whole historical thing. I do want to point out, however, as I probably said this last time about the warrior and the lover, it's easy to think of the patriarchy as all men, but truly the patriarchy doesn't give a damn about men either. The patriarchy are monster boys who want to be in power. They are not mature expressions of the masculine. They are not initiated males, and they wreak all kinds of havoc because they got huge amounts of firepower, but no ability to maturely steward that firepower. So lots of us men grew up hating men too, because I didn't get good examples of the strong, powerful masculine. I didn't develop the strong, powerful masculine. I was in the weakling king scenario. My father was not, he was the weakling king. And I was very wounded and damaged by the patriarchy. So it's not just women that are wounded and damaged by the patriarchy, it's all of us.
And it's not just men that move in patriarchal energy.
Oh, no.
Many, many women, if not most of the women, are polarized in this patriarchal kind of energy as well. So, you know, we didn't have time to go into all that, but, you know, when we use those terms, we need to stop seeing gender, male or female, and we need to start seeing those patterns in ourselves, whether we're male or female.
I do think it's an interesting exercise to kind of think about, again, both of these stories, because the Grail myths actually are sort of the underground story to the above ground story of Christianity. Because there's a lot of reversals, and there's a way in which you can kind of see that as being compensatory in some ways. But even in the story of Jesus, there's the story of the Good Shepherd who has a flock of 100, and 99 of the flock are safe inside the pen during the storm, but he goes out to rescue the one that's missing. That's the true sovereign kind of thing. It's inclusive caring. We're not okay until everybody's okay. As opposed to, I'm going to get mine, screw you. And so you can begin to think about, again, what developmental processes you were successful with because your parents were able to channel this energy, and what developmental processes were unsuccessful because they were not able to channel this energy. Again, you don't have to go very far to find the shadow side of this stuff. I know I probably mentioned last time it's an old movie, but it's a great movie to talk about the tyrant holdfast. It's called Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Have any of you seen that movie? Some of you seen it? Not Marlon Brando, no. It's Paul Newman.
Oh, Paul Newman, yes.
Paul Newman and Elizabeth Taylor. And I forget is it Burl Ives or...
The dad?
Huh?
His dad or her dad?
Yeah, the patriarchal father in that. Was that Burl Ives?
I thought it was.
Well, he's just a real nasty piece of work, and he's the castrating shadow king. And of course, he castrates his son, and his son becomes an alcoholic, is what the part that Paul Newman plays. But it's a great movie, and highly recommend you see it. And when you see the movie, look at it for where's everybody developed in this, and where's the shadow king. Now, a lot of film and myth and story and fairy tales also have a lot to do with the king. There's some really wonderful fairy tales that have to do with this king and queen energy. In fact, many of the fairy tales have to do with this king and queen energy. So you don't have to go far, particularly in like Grimm Brothers, to find some really wonderful stories. And you can work these stories and view them and think about them and relate them back to your own life. And in many ways, they're just much better at teaching this material than, say, scientific verbiage. One of the ones that Robert Bly used so successfully is called Iron John or Iron Hans, and it is really a magnificent story. If you ever get a chance to see a YouTube maybe of Robert Bly doing that. Robert Bly now has Alzheimer's, so he's no longer in public life, but for many years he was one of the real great I think speakers, particularly around men's work, and he really worked that tale because it's got a lot to do with kingship. But so did this movie that we're all going to watch again tomorrow night. And so when we get together tomorrow to view that, I want you all to kind of, really be looking at the dynamics of this and seeing where is the sovereign, where is the woundedness, because this is a tale of healing and coming into this full fruition through wounding. As Mary just pointed out earlier, this is what got most of us out of the kitchen. These deep wounds that are not just injuries, they're often wounds all the way to the soul. They're what starts us on this quest. But then they're also what leads us into these kind of groups where we get to meet people who are as wounded as we are, but also really beautiful. And we kind of transcend all that hierarchical stuff. And we really get to see the essence of people, and it's really quite transformative from my point of view. Just to go over again the diagram that I handed all of you when we first started here. If you start off with the queen and king energy, at its lowest level, it's just mere power. So people who are really interested in power are people who are trying to channel this king and queen energy, but they may be doing it in a very shadowy way. When you start moving up the ladder of maturity, you get to a place where you're not just interested in personal power. In fact, from my point of view, mere power and having power over others is quite evil. It's anti-life from my point of view. But when you get beyond that, you get to a place where you can really start thinking about ordering and providing for everyone. The next level would be centering and calmness. If you find yourself with a lot of anxiety, you probably need more work in the warrior sovereign section. Because the lover and the magician are full of anxiety. The lover, because it's terrified of losing connection, and it can't set boundaries, so it can't protect itself. And the magician also can't do anything except to know. And so those spaces tend to be really chaotic. If you find your life, or you look back on your life, as I have on mine, I had some periods of tremendous chaos. And they are time periods when I was flooding with lover and sometimes magician energy. The more I've gotten in touch with the warrior and the sovereign, the more calm I become, the more centered I am. And then the capacity for inclusive caring. Where again, you don't just care for the special group or those that can do for you, you care for everybody. And then ultimately, the goal of blessing. Any comments, questions about all this? I have done such a fantastic job that there are no questions. This is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
You are amazing.
Take a bow.
How's everybody doing?
I say field trip to Glastonbury.
Field trip to,
You what? The
field trip to Glastonbury.
Well, if you do get a chance to go there, I mean, it is a wonderful place. I mean, that whole part of England is kind of the Bermuda Triangle of the UK. You know, there's all kinds of weird and strange things around there. Not the least of which is Stonehenge and Avebury and some of the megalithic sites, but just some of the strange phenomena like this crop circles and, of course, in folklore, the witches and fairies and all the other things that inhabit that land. It is definitely worth the trip there. It's a little bit out there in some ways for a lot of folks, but still, it's just that you see that people are going there questing for something. They may not know what they're going there for, but that sense of, I think it's a sense of connection to this whole business about kingship, which again we've kind of lost, particularly in America.
Bottom line, though, is that all of that is projected outside of ourselves, and the true journey is reclaiming it from the inside. Right? So we're moving in these because all of that is metaphor for a psychological process. So, and this is organic when you've really worked on all the other quadrants. You just spontaneously come into this centered point. which is the sovereign. So it's,
I want to close with a quote. It's called Ancient Wisdom, Modern Science, Four Great Tasks. Although it is a much ignored subject in modernity, the process of psychological and spiritual growth is well established. Ancient wisdom combined with insights from depth psychology over the last 150 years have yielded an amazing amount of information on what it takes to make a mature human. Yet it is precisely the failure of modern culture to value, practice, and maintain systems that are dedicated to keeping this awareness and practice at the forefront that could be blamed for many of the current crises facing the modern world. It is a lack of mature expressions of both feminine and masculine that are resulting in a fragmenting culture. The lack of mature leadership, stewardship, and creativity are rendering us incapable of solving personal, family, and community problems and even creating global level crises. That's the bad news. The good news is that there are resources found deep within the human psyche that can be accessed to help us in this great time of need.
cool. Alrighty.
So
So-
thank you all for your attention tonight and sticking with this material. We'll continue to talk about it, particularly after we view the movie, but I know this is a tough time of the week to be doing this kind of stuff, and I appreciate all of you staying with us.
Okay, so breathwork tomorrow, try to get here at about 8:30 if you can. Sunday we'll do 9, but tomorrow we'll try to do